Hi, everybody. I'm Jill, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the first of my hour conversations on disentangling patriarchy. So these conversations are about different sort of aspects of things that all have to do with insidious ways, invisible ways that patriarchy, the structures of patriarchy maintain power and control. And I'm very excited to invite my first guest for today, whose name is Tanya Selvaratnam. And I have known Tanya I got the name right, for a long time. And Tanya is, I'm going to read this, you guys, because I want to get it all right. She's a writer, an artist, and an Emmy-nominated and multiple Webby-winning producer with more than 25 years of experience in the areas of arts and social justice. She received both her graduate and undergraduate degrees in Chinese and legal history from Harvard University. Tanya is the author of 2 books. One of them we're talking about today. Always wanted to show a book. It's called Assume Nothing, A Story of Intimate Violence. She also wrote The Big Lie. Okay, Assume Nothing has been optioned by Disney Television and it's in development. Tanya's writing has been published in all kinds of places, including the New York Times and Vogue, Glamour, CNN, NBC News, and McSweeney's. She's been an advisor and producer for Four Freedoms, which catalyzes public discourse and civic engagement through the arts. And she's also produced many films and art projects by artists such as Mickalene Thomas and Carrie Mae Weems. Okay, in her recent book, Assume Nothing, Tanya bravely recounts the intimate abuse she suffered from former New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. And she uses her story as a prism to examine the domestic violence crisis plaguing America. And I'm going to read a quote to start the conversation, which is in the book. Selvaratnam very bravely and compellingly uses her personal experience to shine a light on the global crisis of violence against women, an important book for the women's rights movement. Assume Nothing demonstrates that violence against women exists across race, class, economic status, and education levels, and may be perpetrated by those we think of as allies. It dispels the myth that there are certain types of victims and perpetrators. It will help a lot of people, and particularly those who hesitate to identify as a victim survivor for fear of losing their grounding both publicly and privately. That's from Yasmin Hassan, who is the executive director of Equality Now. So I'm going to start with my first question. Tanya, thank you so much for being here. You're such a brave and amazing person. My first question is, could you explain what intimate violence is? Because some of us don't know, and it's important to understand that.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you, Jill, because I'm so honored to be your first guest. And I love the title of your exhibition, and I love to disentangle patriarchy.
Oh, good.
So here we go.
Okay.
So intimate violence, most people think of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And those types of violence take many different forms. They're not just physical. It can be emotional, verbal, legal, digital, financial. I call the book A Story of Intimate Violence, specifically to refer to violence that happens in the sexual context.
Oh.
And trigger warning about what I will say, but when the book came out, I was shocked by how many people reached out to me, mostly women, but also men, saying that they had experienced intimate violence too. And it's the kind that usually happens behind closed doors between 2 people, and it's violence in the bedroom. So in my case, it was choking, slapping, spitting during sex. It's embarrassing to talk about these details, but I also feel that by describing the micro details, it makes it more identifiable. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was so brave of you. Do you want to explain a little bit? Because I reread the book last night, which it's actually really, I read it before and I read it again, and it's a really great read. But there's so many. Can you talk about how you decided to come forward? Because obviously you're with a very public person who is very powerful, who's sort of been on the side of women, and it must have been very, very difficult for you at that point to decide to come forward and to be brave and to do that. Do you want to? A lot of the book deals with that, but maybe you could Talk about
Well, a
that.
few days ago, there were actually a group. I had a spontaneous ladies' hang at my house. It was very spontaneous. We were out at dinner and then wanted to continue chatting, and then other women came and met us, and two of them were young women in their 20s, and uh, they were asking about my book and the series that's being developed based on the book. And it turned out that one of the young women had been assaulted when she was a child. And then when you start going around the room in those groups, those coven of women, you often find that there are multiple people who've experienced some form of abuse at
Yeah.
some point in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And in reality, the very devastating statistics are that about 1 in 4 women will experience some form of abuse or harassment during their lifetime. So one of the reasons I decided to come forward was to chip away at the conditioning that normalizes these statistics, that normalizes violence. But the very immediate catalyst for me was when I discovered that I was not the first that had been abused by this particular perpetrator, that I was in fact part of a pattern, and that later I would discover that the pattern was even longer
Oh,
than I realized before I came forward and before I wrote the book. Because after my book came out, I heard from people who had been abused as long as 40 years before me
by the same person.
by the same person. So that so as humiliating as the details of my story are, I also knew that my friends would be my friends, my work would be my work. Some people might drift, but I could go on with my life. And I recognize that I am privileged to have been able to speak out because most people suffer in silence. So I thought for me, it was about doing the right thing and also making sure as much as I could that a woman after me did not experience the same abuse by him.
Right.
I wanted to end that cycle of violence.
Did you notice when you were with this individual who was sort of a powerful person that his kind of exerting of control and I mean other things he didn't want you to do? Other did this bleed over to other parts of your life? I think there was something where he didn't like the way you dressed or something, and there were other signs of other parts of your relationship that he or your hair and things like that.
He would want me to tie my hair up because my hair, I'm Sri Lankan, and my hair, when it's humid, gets frizzy, and I love it. It gets big,
Mhm.
but he didn't like it. So he wanted me to tie my hair up. I have scars on my torso from surgery for cancer, 2 different types of cancer, tumor that was removed right in front of my heart. And the scar, I think, is quite sexy.
Yeah, I think
It
that, yeah.
goes like right down the torso. He would, if I would wear a shirt or V-neck that showed the scar, he would stare at it as if it were ugly. And of course, this type of behavior, coercive control, demeaning behavior, it didn't start out like that in the relationship. What often characterizes abusive relationship is they start out like a fairy tale. You get swept off your feet. It's like the love bombing,
Right.
which I experienced.
Active,
But then there's like the drip,
active
drip, drip.
you all the time, and then and how else in your book you detail some of the other ways of him always wanting you by his side, not wanting you to
Yes.
travel, and other ways he besides the bedroom, how he showed controlling behavior, which now in retrospect you could think of as sort of a sign. Is that true? Or are those some of the signs of potential men who could be?
Yes. I mean, in retrospect, when I look back at the person who got entangled in that abusive relationship, um, I I recognize her, but I also can't believe that it was me.
Really? Because you saw the signs, you knew, because you're very aware of what those signs were, but yet,
When you're in it, it's very hard to see out of it, which is
yeah,
why it's so important to be able to talk about it. And in my case, to write a book that hopefully encourages other people to talk about it. I mean, the number of conversations I've had with people, some of whom I've known for decades, that had never told me about the abuse that they experienced because we're conditioned, in the same way we're conditioned to normalize violence, we're conditioned not to talk about the violence that we experience.
right.
because
And
it's
it happened in other books.
negative.
I think you list some of the things here, some of the, in the back of the book, some of the signs of sort of controlling behavior that we should be aware of that are part of the um, the picture of this kind of person who could eventually um, be a perpetrator. Is that the word?
Yes,
I mean,
perpetrator. Well, I walk the reader gets to see the stages that I went through to get into an abusive relationship.
mhm.
The fairy tale stage, then the demeaning and controlling behavior that seeps in, and then the physical abuse. And they also get to see how I got out, which was a friend of mine who's like my sister, since something was wrong, had heard from other people that I seemed to be different. And she reached out and started asking me questions. And I told her that things were rocky. And after a series of questions, she then landed on one question that kind of took my breath away in that moment, but that I wasn't going to lie about. She just said very bluntly, matter of factly, "Does he hit you?" And I just said yes. And she knew that at that point, she did not have the skills and expertise to help me. And so she asked if I would be willing to speak to a friend of hers, whom I had met many years before, who is a domestic violence expert.
Mhm.
And she texted both of us. We made a time to talk. And this domestic violence expert and attorney, when I described the pattern of behavior, she said, "Tanya, what you have been experiencing is classic domestic violence." And it took her saying that for the scales to fall off of my eyes.
Right.
And she also helped me extract myself.
See it in yourself, which I think is a
Right. You need somebody who's going to be that mirror and tell you what you might not be able to recognize yourself. And also, a lot of people were shocked that it happened to me.
yeah, because you're very aware and you're a feminist and you're really smart and educated and active and political. One wouldn't think that you would be the person this would happen
But
to. Mhm.
well, the um now I understand and have sympathy for the person, myself, who got entangled in the abusive relationship. I had fractures that were waiting to be tapped into. The thing with abusers is they're very skilled at identifying what your insecurities are and manipulating them. So in my case, because I had just been coming off of a series of health crises, multiple miscarriages, and 2 types of cancer. I had scars down my torso, and also a divorce. I was, I was, even though I didn't realize it at the time, I was more vulnerable than I realized.
And
And
he knew that. He picked up on that.
well, they have this like sensor where they know they can identify their prey.
Right.
And it was, for me, the perfect storm at that time.
That time.
Now that would never happen to me.
Right. And so do you speak to like young girls, like, I have a daughter and whatever, other women, and say what to look out for, or how do
Yes.
what are ways that well, anybody really, but particularly like the young girls you saw, like you know, what to look out for?
Well, the book, I wanted it to I wanted it to read almost like a novel, like a
That's
thriller, to
very,
get people reading,
yeah,
to build the suspense, so that when they get to the end, there's then an appendix that is a checklist that I collaborated with the domestic violence expert Jennifer Friedman on. And that's the part that I'm almost most proud of,
yeah.
that there's this checklist full of resources at the end that people can refer to.
So
And
who is watching this, at the end of the book, it's included at the end, and I highly recommend getting the book and looking at that, especially if you're mothers of daughters or any other women. It's really important to be aware of, and also to know who you can call and reach out to. I I want to ask you one question. I'm not sure how long, but there's a quote in here from Gloria Steinem, which I'm going to go to, and it sort of I just wanted to a little bit connect intimate partner violence with other kind of gender-based violence and how that fits into the whole kind of power patriarchy kind of scheme. And there's a quote here um, where Gloria says, we're never going to have a democratic, peaceful society until we have democratic, peaceful homes. We haven't addressed the basic problem, which is that men live in a society that tells them that they have to dominate in order to be masculine. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, like, what is this need to dominate in men and how it manifests in the home, particularly in cases where men sort of say, like, they're saying the right thing in public. Like, you think this guy's like a real feminist and they're really, saying that they have our similar shared values for a democratic, peaceful society, yet that's kind of an outward persona, that's a public person, and yet when it comes to home, there's a shift in what's expected, and the domination and control, which of course is part and feeds into all this kind of violence. So I'm interested to know about your feelings about that, the shift between the public and private, and how that plays out.
There's the conditioning happens from the time we're born. We're born into a cycle of violence. We're born into trauma, and then it gets perpetuated. And I think about when we're in school, when we first start school, we're conditioned to think that if a boy teases us, he likes us. Like, the conditioning begins right there. So I feel that the interventions, I want to make peace and kindness more exciting than violence. And the only way for that to be achieved is to have the introduction of peace and violence as more desirable happen from the time we're born. And also, men are conditioned
and all these
to
things
dominate.
like into it, like, I mean, the kind of cartoons that boys watch that whatever, the Superman, their violence is sort of what kids are taught from a young age. I mean, it's sort of it's associated with masculinity, which it doesn't have to be. And there's certainly other societies that have existed where that was not the model for masculinity. It wasn't. Yeah.
Well, and there are societies like indigenous cultures where there was no gender. Like,
exactly.
How beautiful is that?
Yeah. Or there were different multiple genders, but certainly they were not based on power and domination and domination. Yes. They were equal. They had equal, different but equal, and one did not dominate over another. And gender was way more fluid. I think I believe that up until the time of sort of Christianity, many cultures did not have just two genders. I mean, in fact, people who were third gender and who were both were often worshipped as the you were more in touch with the divine if you were
yes. And actually, my next book, which is a novel, is about intimate pleasure. And I will say that, like, after writing a book about intimate violence, writing a book about intimate pleasure is a great departure, but also very related. Because I think that if we can get more in touch with how to experience pleasure,
right,
we can outroot as much as possible the desire for violence.
Right.
And outroot feels very appropriate because the book's called Leave Me Alone.
Oh.
It's about liking plants more than people.
Uh-huh. There's so much in indigenous societies too about connecting the way we treat plants and the way we treat the way we treat other people. It's sort of the same spectrum of about a society, they say, kind of based on care and mutual respect.
Yes.
Earth and plants and animals and other human beings without hierarchy, without these structures of hierarchy, which is sort of what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
Yes. And it's about biophilia. It's about a love of nature. And a love of nature is not just about liking, to have plants in your home and taking care of them, or it really is about, like, doing something for nature, like planting something, taking care of the soil.
Right. Can you go back? I'm sorry, I'm not sure of our time thing.
I think we have 9 minutes.
Okay, you said about the childhood, I wanted to get some of your suggestions, like about the ideas. You say that this sort of patriarchal structure of dominance, or whatever we want to call that, that male gender needing to be violent, needing to be domineering, you think starts in childhood and the way kids are raised. Can you say other, not that I need you to solve society's problems, but other ways you think possibly, no, but other ways that this manifests and things we can possibly do about, on our, I mean, to break this, and Nina Menkes is going to come on and she's going to talk about the way, the patriarchal gaze and what that means in cinema and the way women are looked at in the cinema. We know it happens in popular culture. We know it happens in media. We know it happens in things like women not being paid the same as men. But I wanted to give you in more in terms of relationships, like how is that like, um, well, both in relationships and in your experience in politics and art, like how do you see a way to have a more um, balanced kind of equitable society, like practical ways out of this domination kind of model that you've seen the worst of?
Well, I mean, thinking about politics, um, because especially in America, we're so divided by our political affiliations that we forget to see human before political party. And when we do that, we all lose. So it's like how to, because most people, I think about the attacks on trans rights right now, the attacks on abortion rights.
Mhm.
Like with trans people, it's not that those who are enacting all of this really insidious legislation want people to die, but they want them to be invisible.
Mhm.
So it's about invisibilizing. So I feel like what we as storytellers and artists can do is make 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 people and make issues more visible.
Mhm.
That's why I wrote a book about intimate violence, to make it more visible. Like it is out there. And in terms of getting to a better place, besides making peace and kindness more exciting than violence, I think it's also about abundance. And it's hard to talk about abundance when, quite frankly, most people are suffering. And they're suffering because of the systems that we've inherited that um, are hierarchies and that divide us and that create inequalities and inequity. So it's about, everyone doing what they can to look out for each other.
Exactly.
And that means diminishing the need for competition. Like the world is big enough.
Exactly.
How do we go from being transactional to being supportive?
Supportive. Okay, well, that's sort of exactly what this project was trying to do to come up, and you're just so amazing that we had you for our first speaker, because that's exactly what I'm trying to kind of make in my little way, make visible these invisible structures that are so, I think some people we don't even understand these structures that are so internalized that, that we don't even understand are part of us. And just to get out of it for 1 minute, to see it and then see how these things are linked and what we can all do in our own possible ways to create this more just, equitable society that I think most people want, I mean, they do, I think, I hope. And I think a lot of it has to do with this way that we see patriarchy. I mean, this is a dumb example, but if you looked at Donald Trump, it'd be very clear that he would be someone who would be more apt to be, I don't want to say an abuser, but I mean, that type of personality is, I mean, we've seen how he treats women. I mean, that's very clear. But there are also all kinds of men who are part of that same system and not as clearly um, coded for that. Does that make sense? I don't know how to say that in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I see him as the fruit, not the root of the problem.
Exactly.
And people waste too much time trying to figure out how so and so could do that, how so and so could behave so badly, how so and so could have such a dissonance between their, how someone can do the right thing in some instances, like my abuser did, but then behave so insidiously in other instances. How could that happen? I'm not interested in trying to figure them out. I think we waste too much time like kind of flailing and wailing, when really what we should be doing is focusing on us and what we can do to rise up better together. And
Exactly.
that to me is like a goal. And to go back to intimate pleasure, because it's like so on my brain and the research is really, really fun. My OBGYN, because we always have conversations about what I'm working on when I see her, and she is a big advocate for every teenage girl being given a vibrator. And I thought, now, wouldn't that be wonderful if just like as soon as you are, become a teenager, get a vibrator. Like it should just be given to you and it should be free.
And free, yeah. That's a good idea. We can bring my daughter on to discuss that. She'd have a lot to say.
Okay.
I hear laughs over there. Well, anyway, Tanya, thank you so much. This was so, you're so brave and you're so amazing and you're an amazing activist and writer. And we're so glad to have your voice. And thank you so much for writing this book. And I hope people will read it. And it's a sad story, but you're so brave. And I hope you're helping so many other people to come out and tell their stories and to be able to free themselves from these situations that they're in, because I mean it's true, nobody would have expected it, and I'm sure it's
Well,
happening.
I end the book by saying, let's split the world open together. And I think part of the way we do it is by sharing our stories. And I think we're all amazing. We're all brave. We just have to be
Out.
supported to show it.
Thank you so much.